Hello students, we'll be discussing the UPSC History Optional Paper 2 Modern World History segment because Modern India has already been discussed and uploaded on the YouTube. The discussion has been done by Mohammad Tariq sir. So I'll be discussing first the Modern World History, the portion that I take in the foundation, and also the section B of paper 1, that is Medieval Indian History. The objective of the discussion is to let you understand the expectation of UPSC by illustrating what you should have written, what is the right way to write this answer. And second, what are the various dimensions to cover, because I understand it is far more easier to analyze the paper once it is done, and that also after a few days. But again, from the academic point of view, it is also important to understand that what is the overall level of difficulty, where do we have to restrict ourselves in a 20-marker question, in a 15-marker question, how much can we write, where to incorporate the views of historian if we are able to remember in examination. And for those students who are appearing for next year, I would suggest that you should also take this paper as a type of awareness, that this paper is going to raise awareness about, it is going to give you exposure about what type of questions are asked, how your understanding of the overall structure, and sometimes very minute questions are asked. As far as I can say, the level of difficulty of paper 2 was comparatively easier. Many questions in modern India and modern world history had come from PYQs, and some of the questions which had even not come from PYQs, but they were more or less along predictable line. As far as paper 1 is concerned, definitely paper 1 was more application based, where in ancient India and in medieval India, they have asked micro topics, like for the first time they have asked the contribution of art and culture of Kalandriya sect, the Silsila. So something that students generally tend to ignore. Or they have come and asked a question from Malwa school of painting. Some of the questions are very, very interesting also, like we will discuss the position of women, and especially Hindu women versus Muslim women during the Sultanate period. So we find that questions have been asked from culture, questions have been asked in paper 1 from social dimensions, questions have been asked from political history. This time they have asked 2 questions from Marathas. And that also, the Battle of Panipat and its significance with respect to political economy was something that was not asked over the last, say, 2 decades. So we will not get into too much of detailed discussion. I will try to upload a detailed solution PDF format of the sections which I am taking, so that all the students who have appeared and who are appearing can take a note of it, and then they can prepare accordingly. Now I'll start with the paper 2 section B, Modern World History. Critically examine the following statements in about 150 words. So you are expected to write about 150 to 170 words. And in these 10 marker question, you are expected to be very, very precise. So let's see which are the questions. The ideas raised by Enlightenment thinkers were profoundly unsettling and challenging to the old regime society and the political order. Now, when we see this question, so the question says that they are talking about some of the Enlightenment thinkers. So who are the Enlightenment thinkers here? And what are the ideas that they have raised? And then what is this old regime society and political order? So if we try to analyze this question, question 5A, there can be multiple ways in which you can introduce this question's answer. One can be that you can give a very, very crisp but a very rich definition of enlightenment. You can start by writing that what enlightenment refers to. Enlightenment during 17th, 18th century was an intellectual, philosophical and social movement in which a number of thinkers applied reason and came out with their own understanding of the prevailing evils in the socio-political and economic domain. These thinkers have also presented an alternate view in these dimensions. So the impact that these ideas have made on the society, politics, economy, religion, law, that constitutes enlightenment. So you can start with a brief introduction that what enlightenment refers to. Now we know that as far as enlightenment is concerned, so this talks about enlightenment thinkers and versus the evils or the problems of society and politics, political order. So we can start by, we can break this question into two subparts. What are the political issues? First is absolutism. We know that the politics of Europe from 16th century after Reformation, after the decline of feudalism, was characterized by absolutism. Absolutism, you don't have to define absolutism, but you can understand that absolutism is about centralized monarchy, unrestricted power, no limits to the power, divine rights of the king. So the king centralizes all power. So we find that there are a number of political thinkers who have written against absolutism. So who are these political thinkers? We have to start by mentioning that social contract theory. So answer writing is also about focusing upon the key words and key themes. So whoever is evaluating will look for this key theme, social contract theory. And then you have to write the ideas of John Locke. So briefly, you have to mention that John Locke in his book, Two Treatises of Government, (1689), has not only criticized the divine rights of the king as something that is a man-made myth, something that has not existed because God is equal, God has created equal, all human beings as equal. So he says that there is nothing like divine rights, there is nothing like absolutism. In fact, there is a contract between the state and the governed, and according to the contract, the state is supposed to protect, he talks about natural rights. So his social contract is based on the upholding and preservation of natural rights, and he says life, liberty and property is this. John Locke is also called as the father of classical liberalism. Liberalism is a political ideology which consists of a number of things, but it says that the government has to provide liberty. But again, because it is a 10-marker question, we cannot write too much on John Locke. Then we have to say that the person who gave a new dimension to social contract theory was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So you are expected to write about Rousseau. Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract. So you have to write that Rousseau in his book, The Social Contract, 1762, he has first of all presented the idea of popular sovereignty. So what is difference between Rousseau and Locke is that Locke still says that sovereignty is with the state. Rousseau says that no, sovereignty is with the people. And then Rousseau in his work, Social Contract, gave the idea of general will. So very interesting. He says that laws are made by the state, but laws are made on the basis of general will, and general will is something that is framed by the open and democratic consultation within a community. We can also write that another thinker who has written against absolutism is Montesquieu. Because in absolutism, there is nothing like accountability of the state. But Montesquieu in his book, The Spirit of Laws, has provided a solution to it by taking inspiration from John Locke's ideas, and he talks about principle of separation of powers. So you can write about all these thinkers. You can write about Jeremy Bentham also. So Jeremy Bentham, in his book, An Introduction to the Principles of Laws and Morals and Legislation, 1798, he talks about utilitarianism. So everybody is saying that what a state is supposed to do, what a state must do. So one thing we find that they have criticized against absolutism. They have criticized against this system of privileges, that power does not belong to those who are privileged. So you can briefly write about all of them. Then we move to the evils in the society. So what are the evils in the society? Evils in the society was still there was hierarchy. Earlier in Middle Ages, hierarchy was based on land ownership. Now hierarchy was based on wealth. Hierarchy was based on power. And even the members of the church enjoyed religious hierarchy. Even in the church, there was religious hierarchy. So again, a number of authors have written against these things. We will again bring Rousseau here. Rousseau was the one who in his work discourse on the origins of inequality. So we have to again, it is very important that when you talk about thinkers, if possible, you can mention their important work and what is the core idea. So Rousseau in his work discourse on the origins of inequality. It is very good if you can remember the year. If not, then it's okay. He has referred that in the current society, he says that conventional inequality, artificial inequality, man-made inequality based on wealth, based on race, all this has become more dominant over the natural inequalities or natural differences. So he says that these inequalities are the basis of, it is the basis of all evils and conflict in the society. As far as religious hierarchy is concerned, we can mention or we can give reference to Voltaire. Voltaire was critical of the interference and the influence that was enjoyed by the church. So he has written in his book, Treatise of Toleration. So we can say that the ideas of these thinkers, these scholars, inspired and shaped the course of a number of revolutions like American Revolution, French Revolution, and to some extent we can say even the Glorious Revolution 1688 in England. So that is why we can conclude by writing all these points. Moving to the next question. The American Civil War was a result of disparity of needs of industrial North and agrarian South. Now again, in this question, you should start by writing that American Civil War was a military conflict during 1861 to 65 between the American Union under President Abraham Lincoln and the secessionist state, Confederate State of America. So here you have to mention that what the American Civil War is about. So they have written that this So start by briefly mentioning an introduction of the American Civil War. It is between the American Union, United States of America, versus the Confederate States of America. Now, Confederate States of America was a secessionist state. Consisting of 11 slave states, means 11 slave states led by South Carolina seceded or walked out of the Union. This war was fought during 1861 to 65 and the war revolved around two issues. You have to write this in the introduction. One is the issue of slavery and second is the issue of restoring and preserving the integrity of the Union. So always write a very rich but crisp introduction so that the person who is evaluating understands that you have a complete know-how or command over the topic. Now you have to start that the American Civil War was also an outcome of the North-South divide. So this is a question which I often discuss in GS classes also. So it is an outcome of the divide, the differences between the free states in the North and the slave states in the South. And there are multiple bases of these divide or differences. One of it is economic. So according to, because it is a history optional, you have to write that according to historian Charles Baird has written that American Civil War was a capitalist movement. Charles Baird was a person who has written a very famous book, An Economic Interpretation of the American Constitution 1913. He has even analyzed the American Revolution and the American Constitution, and he has even written on the American Civil War. In fact, Eric Foner's book also, Road to Freedom, that also has written about the American Civil War, and they have analyzed and they have presented the American Civil War in terms of the economic dimension. So basically, this statement that writes is that when in industrial north, there was emergence of textile industries, and these industrialists did not like the idea that the raw cotton, the raw material cotton was being supplied to them at same price at which it was being supplied to their competitor, British textile industries. They demanded imposition of tariff on the export of raw cotton. So basically this dispute was a tariff dispute. So they said that the government must restrict the export of cotton, which the southern states were not ready, because they believed that this might affect their profitability, this might affect their choices, and in future they might be forced to sell their raw cotton to the north, to supply it to the north at a cheaper price. So we find that on this tariff issue, when the northern states were able to pressurize the government and the government was ready to apply a tariff, then in 1832, one of the states had even threatened to secede. So we read that on this tariff dispute, there was a crisis in 1832, and that crisis is famously called as nullification crisis. However, the secession of South Carolina was prevented, but the problems remained. So this problem, that is why it is said that American Civil War was a civil war between the industrialist north and the agrarian south. That is what it is mentioned here. However, in this question, briefly in the conclusion or somewhere you have to write that there were other issues also which led to the American Civil War. Like one was the issue of unresolved issue of secession, constitutional issue. The second was the issue of slavery. Third was the issue that was the status of newly created states. So I also say that American Civil War was also an outcome of territorial and political dispute. So whenever they were expanding westwards and acquiring territories and creating new states, there was always a confusion whether this state has to be a free state or slave state. They tried so many formula. They had come up with the Missouri Compromise. They had come up with the multiple ideas had come. But finally, the Supreme Court had to nullify and say that no, we will decide it by plebiscite. So you have to write in the conclusion that yes, this is one thing, but there was also a socio-demographic divide. There was a territorial political conflict. There was a limitation of the constitution. So multiple factors, and then the election of an abolitionist candidate, Republican candidate, a person who had pledged, who had said that an house divided against itself cannot stand. I will, if elected to power, I will abolish slavery. So here we have to briefly mention in introduction. So that is how you write good introductions. When you know that you have a lot of content, I am sure everybody writing this exam would have a lot of content. But the challenge in a 10 marker is that you have to limit your content. Moving ahead. Again, the third question is an easier one, I would say. Why? Because it is a statement which was given by John Maynard Keynes. Everybody knows that in the unification of Germany, the role of blood and iron. In fact, blood and iron was a slogan which was given by Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was the Chancellor of Prussia, and Bismarck had said that I will unify Germany through war and diplomacy. Blood here refers to war, and iron refers to arms, manufacturing of arms. So he said that I will make war materials and I will use it in war. However, John Maynard Keynes says that no, it is not only because of militarism. So blood and iron here refers to the militarism of Bismarck. And we know that yes, Bismarck had unified Germany by fighting mainly three wars, 1864, 66 and 70. But John Maynard Keynes, he says that it was also an outcome of economic changes. Especially he says that in 1834, when Zollverein was created. Zollverein was a custom union under the leadership of Prussia, and a number of states joined this custom union, and that led to the growth of trade and commerce, that led to the emergence of industries, and that led to a consciousness amongst the people in the north and also the states that what are the benefits, economic benefits of a larger state. In fact, following the Zollverein, we also see the rise of German bourgeois. And these German bourgeois supported the liberals who had played an important role in the 1848 revolutions. Although the 1848 revolutions did not succeed, the Frankfurt Parliament was convened, but they could not take a decisive action on it. But still, according to Keynes, it laid the base. That is why there was a positive consciousness. There was an eagerness amongst the masses. So you have to, briefly, you have to start by saying that what happened after the creation of Zollverein. And then despite that, the rise of German bourgeois, liberals, and then 1848 revolution, but the 1848 revolutions failed. Yet the sentiment was there and the work was carried forward by Bismarck. So you don't have to write much. The revolutions of 1989 simply didn't destroy governments. They destroyed or they ended an ideology. Now, when we talk about 1989, in 1989, we see that a number of governments started falling in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, and then the collapse, the fall of Berlin Wall, November 1989. So that and the unification of Germany, that was like a chain reaction. So in 1989, what happened? 1989, we see this period is called as the autumn of 1989 or the autumn of nations. You can write, it is called as the autumn of nations, when a number of governments started falling like a pack of cards. Now, one of the reasons why these governments fell was that Gorbachev had made it absolutely clear that he is not going to provide any military support to the communist regimes. We know that one of the reasons why communist governments prevailed in the East, despite not having much mass enthusiasm about them, is because the Russians, USSR, gave military aid or military support. And not only support, but we see there was a policy of active intervention. So numerous times, whether it is in Czechoslovakia, whether it is in Hungary, so numerous times, whenever a anti-communist government or a liberal government would be formed, the Soviet army would barge in and they will overthrow by a coup and reinstate. So we find that the Brezhnev doctrine, you can mention that Leonid Brezhnev had made it absolutely sure that we would not allow any democratic government to prevail in East. But Gorbachev put a stop to it. Gorbachev said enough. We are not going to give any military support. And then not only because of the withdrawal of military support by the Russians, but basically the command economy, the Soviet-led economy started collapsing. The Russians themselves were under a lot of economic pressure. When in 1980, the gas prices fell. When in 1980, the OPEC nations who had imposed an embargo, they had imposed a ban, or they had regulated the sale of export of oil, which the Russians benefited from. Now that boom period ended. And Russians also had incurred a lot of defense subsidy or defense expenditure on not only on themselves but also on their allies. So Russians were now in a deep state, and Gorbachev was himself trying to restructure, trying to get the Russian economy back on track. And then the glasnost and perestroika, both of that. So that did not work well for Russians. So Russia itself was in deep troubled waters. In that background, Russia could not help. And one by one, not only the governments fell, it was not about, that is what the question says, that is, it did not just destroy government, but we find that the new governments which came were not the communist governments, but they were altogether different governments. So we find that it was the beginning of or end of communist ideology. And we see that the new governments, we find, for example, in Venezuela. So you can give example. In Venezuela, there was the Velvet Revolution, by which the Communist Party lost badly. In Poland, there was the Solidarity movement. Solidarity movement. In Hungary, after decades, free and fair elections were held. So we find that one by one, it started falling. 1989 is also the year when in China, students protested against the rampant corruption and red tapeism, and they also demanded a free or a more, I would say, transparent political structure. But the Chinese kept themselves, the Chinese communists were absolutely in control. Although in China from 1977, Deng Xiaoping had introduced economic reforms, but we find that Chinese did not yield to the public pressure. And 1989 is also the year when in China, Tiananmen Square massacre happened in June. So everywhere we don't see that communism has fallen. But in a number of states, we see that there was collapse. And this is what Francis Fukuyama also writes. You can mention that Francis Fukuyama, one of the American historians, has written in his book, The End of History and Last Man, that now we'll see the world history reaching its logical phase. It is culminating with the rise of liberal democracy and with the rise of free market capitalism. So this is what something they have said. And if you ask me that why did this happen? Because the price control, the command economy, the over-centralization of power, the lack of invention, the lack of initiative, and more than that, there was a frustration amongst the masses because when they were comparing their quality of life, their per capita income with that in West, especially this contrast was very much manifesting, very much clear in the case of Germany. Western Germany, Western Berlin was as developed, as progressive, as in contrast to the Eastern Berlin, which was very backward. So all these factors, political oppression was there. And then the democracy and the market reforms of the West appealed to the masses. So in this background, we find that when Russians were in a moment of weakness, then the people overthrew these governments and they also rejected the communist ideology. So we find that not only it was the end of the governments, it was the overall fall of communism. So you can write all these aspects. Now moving to the next question. It's a very interesting question, that the course of English industrialization was too long drawn to be considered a revolution or an evolution. So in this question, if we try to analyze in a bit detail, that what is this question about? So this question says that if you talk about industrialization in England, it was long drawn out. Long drawn out means we can say that industrialization in England happened in multiple phases, but primarily we talk about two phases. Let's talk about two phases. 40s, or let's write 1760s, what Eric Hobsbawm says. 1740s, 60s to 1840s, the first phase. This is the first phase, where we see first generation machines, where we see textile driven industrialization was there. And then the second phase from 1850s to, you can say, World War I. So a lot of changes happened gradually over a period of time. This phase has also been called as the technical revolution, because many historians are of the view that although industrial revolution started in England in mid-18th century, but industrialization was limited only to certain sector, mainly it is mining and textile industries. So the real impact of industrialization in all qualities of life and even in the manufacturing sector was seen in the second phase. So UPSC has tended to ask this question, that do you think that something that is so long drawn out how far is it apt to call it a revolution? So probably this, there are two schools, or I would say there are two type of historians. People like Arnold Toynbee, the person actually who coined the term industrial revolution. So he said that industrial revolution refers to the transformative changes in the mode of production. So he says, and this not only it was a transformative change in the mode of production, a change in the place of production from cottage industries to factories, use of machines, modern machines, and production based on economies of scale. So he was the one who says that we have to understand that not only there was the transformation in the manner of production, the volume of production, the place of production, the organizational structure of production, but he also talks about the impact of it. And then another historian, Eric Hobsbawm. So as I say, there are historians, Eric Hobsbawm, who writes in his book, The Age of Revolution. So he talks about, so there are people or historians like Eric Hobsbawm, Arnold Toynbee, who says that yes, it is a revolution, it is a revolution. But then we find that there are historians on the other hand. David Carradine. They have questioned. No, it is not a revolution. It is not a revolution because the changes that happened were gradual. And why this doubt has come? Why this doubt has come in the minds of people like Joel Morker, who said that even the machines or the technological changes which has been highlighted by Toynbee, that did not happen sudden. It took time. So not all the scientific inventions happened in a decade or in a matter of few years. It took about a century, and gradually we see the impact of these technologies in various aspects of life. So people have tried to compare this word. They have taken literally the word revolution, and they have equated the Industrial Revolution with French Revolution or Russian Revolution, where the changes happened rapidly. And not only the changes happened rapidly, but the impact, which was long lasting, also was accomplished in a matter of few years, and in Russia it was in a matter of few months. So what is the argument which is given by these people or historians who say that no, it was not a revolution? So these people who say that it is not a revolution, they focus on process. So इस बात पे ध्यान रखिए. They focus on process. And they say that the process is large, the process is long drawn out. We find that the scientific inventions or industrialization was, Joel Morker has written that IR was not an outcome of a single technological breakthrough. It was not that one night somebody invented a machine and that machine led to all these changes. It was an outcome of incremental changes that were happening in machines. In fact, the machines which were made in the initial stages or were used in initial stages in the industries were very fuel consuming. That is why they were not suitable for other European countries which did not have as much of fuel, in fact coal. Whereas the machines which were made, the same machines which were made, means the same purpose, the later machines which were made say in 1820s were more fuel efficient. So Joel Morker has written, if we talk about this view, has written that it was not an outcome of a single technological breakthrough. If you see spinning jenny 1764, I have written some of the dates. If you see steam engine, so 1776, so many changes have happened. Flying shuttle, so all these changes have happened not rapidly, but it has taken some time. And then another set of historians again who have focused on this process. So they say that the impact of industrialization was also not uniform. Some of the sectors continued to function in the traditional way, especially agriculture. So Pat Hudson says that the agricultural sector, although there was agricultural revolution, but the agricultural sector continued to function in a traditional way. Yes, there was change in the nature of ownership. There was change in the organization of labor. But the machines, the tools, the implements that were used were man-made. Even in mining, we find that although a lot of developments for inventions were happening in mining, but it took considerable period of time. And they say that even railways, people always focus upon railways. So even railways came in England, the infrastructure development came in England much later. So railways came in 1820s in England, and that was much later. By that time, the first phase of industrialization was almost reaching its peak, or it was going to see a changeover. E.P. Thompson, you don't have to remember the name of all the historians, but again, another very interesting historian. E.P. Thompson, in his book, The Making of the English Working Class, he says that not only the process, but I believe that this revolution should not be called as a revolution, because when we talk about industrial revolution, we focus on two aspects. One is the process, and second is the impact on the society. When we talk about the impact on the society, we talk about the emergence of proletariat. We talk about the rise of political consciousness. We see the beginning of trade unionism. So he says that we can say that yes, the government did not encourage. The government passed Combination Acts 1799, 1800, which prevented the mobilization of working class into trade unions. But we cannot neglect the fact that for a significant period of time, people did not have this idea of a proletariat working class consciousness. So this took some time. The British society, David Canadin, he says the British society immediately did not shift to a completely industrial society. Still, the people who migrated were those who lost their land during the enclosure movement or who otherwise did not have land. So those who owned considerable land, they still continued their old agrarian ways. That is what David Canadin writes, and he gives reference to the House of Commons, where still a number of landlords were present. So all these factors have been emphasized upon. So Eric Hobsbawm, now talking about this side. So this side who says that no, it is not an evolution, in many ways it is a revolution, they focus on the impact. So they say fine, we can say that the process was long drawn out. The process was long drawn out, but still we have to understand that why we call it a revolution. We call it a revolution because it affected every quality of the life. So also always in class I say that many things that we take today as a general part of our working life, for example, monthly salary, for example, fixed working hours, for example, quantification of work, for example, talking about work culture, uniform, all these aspects came following Industrial Revolution. So therefore they have said that yes, it's a reality that political revolutions in Europe were more immediate, but why IR should be called as a revolution? Why people like Pat Hudson has said that no, we have to call it a revolution. We have to call it because the impact, which was gradual, but the impact was long lasting, and never ever mankind was affected or shook so much by any revolution as much by industrialization. This is what J.Ed Diamond also writes in his book, that guns, germs and steel. So he writes that the advent of steel, steel means industrialization, enabled Europe to conquer the world. Adam Smith himself has written that there are two significant things which has transformed the fate of Europeans. One was the accidental discovery of America, and second was the beginning of industrialization. So you can write all these aspects that yes, as Eric Hobsbawm has said, that IR was a process which led to the permanent shift from phase 2, what Marx has said, 1, 2, 3, 4. So from phase 2 to phase 3. So from feudalism to industrial capitalism. So we can write about all these aspects. Next question. So this question, the catch was that when you talk about evolution, you talk about all these aspects, even if you don't remember the name of all these historians, but it is important that you focus on process versus impact. So this was the catch in the question. The social and the political landscape. So this is a very interesting question, that the social and the political landscape that emerged in many countries in Europe after the First World War was uniquely suited to the rise of fascism. So often in class I ask this question, that in what circumstances people trade their political freedom for economic well-being and political stability. Because we say, from the time when we talk about political modernity, we always say that we value liberty, we want political freedom, we want a freedom of expression. So why is it that, and in what circumstances do we find that people not only compromise, but they give an enthusiastic support to dictatorial, to authoritarian, to totalitarian regimes? How is it that when you see in the documentaries, that whenever Adolf Hitler, whenever General Tojo, whenever Benito Mussolini, whenever they arrive, people swarm like bees and people are very much enthusiastic. So we have to understand, that is why the question was asked, that what was the basis for the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe? So what are the factors which has led to the rise of Nazism and fascism? And that is what they have given. So in this question, you can briefly start by writing about fascism. Just a line, introduction. So what do you mean by fascism? You can say that fascism is not exactly a political ideology. Fascism is a hodgepodge of ideas. It is more than a political ideology. It is a program of action. However, fascism is characterized by, quickly write what are the characteristics of fascism. So then, once you have written what are the characteristics of fascism, so in introduction, this is question 6b. In the introduction, quickly introduce fascism. Say that fascism is characterized by totalitarianism. Fascism is characterized by polygenetic nationalism. Roger Griffin's theory, we will discuss. Nationalism. It is characterized by militarism. It is characterized by statism. It is a counter-revolution. Quickly, just write all these very key words. Fascism talks about autarky, a corporate state. Fascism talks about anti-communism, etc. So we have to write that we see the rise of fascism. Fascism was not one, but it was practiced in multiple ways. Now, what was the socio-political landscape? So after World War I, post-World War I, we see the rise of fascism. What are the factors which has led to the rise of fascism? So first of all, we understand that World War I was very devastating, a total war in which even the victor powers, the allied powers had suffered tremendously. So around 1.4 million people had died collectively because of the war and also because of the outbreak of epidemics. So this World War I, if you talk about the psychological aspects, let's start with psychology. The psychological aspect. So World War I had generated an all-around negative sentiment. You have to start with this. There was all-around, there was disillusionment. With religion, there was rise of atheism. People stopped believing in God, many people. There was nihilism, complete negation of existence. And then there was disenchantment. Many people, especially the Germans or those who were defeated, they were enchanted with democracy. They believed that there is no democracy, true democracy. There is no true justice. So this sense of betrayal, this sense of anger, this sense of hopelessness prevailed in the society. People people had this sense. Even Italians, not only about Germans, even Italians had this sense of mutilated victory. Italy had participated the war following the 1915 London Agreement with Britain, where they were promised a number of territories, or they expected a number of territories along Adriatic and also the German colonies in Africa. However, not all the demands of Italy was honored and was fulfilled at the Paris Peace Conference. At the Paris Peace Conference, which was hijacked, I would say, primarily by Britain and France, Italian representative Orlando was in a sorry state. So they were feeling betrayed, they were feeling humiliated, they were feeling sidelined. Italy is an aspirational state. So we find not only the Germans, but even the Italians, despite ending on the victor side, they were feeling betrayed, they were feeling humiliated. So this sense was there. There was an anger also. We see that there was an anger. Anger, and not only anger was there, but there was a sense of helplessness and hopelessness amongst youth. Understand this. Due to prevailing unemployment. So unemployment was a major crisis. We find that post World War I, many of the armies were demobilized. Like the German army was reduced to 1 lakh. So there was not only a sense of loss of war, humiliation, but the male ego was also hurt. So one factor is the psychological aspect. And then to add to all this, the Paris Peace Conference and the treaties. So now we'll talk about the next aspect. We'll talk about the political aspect. What is the political aspect? So first, the Paris Peace Conference. And then the treaties that were signed, especially the Treaty of Versailles. This was an imposed dictated treaty. A treaty which not only crushed the Germans in multiple ways, imposed a heavy war penalty, but a treaty which did not heal the, I would say, the anger or the rivalry between the French and the Germans. It in fact only added more fuel and fire to it. So because of this treaty, the Germans not only stopped having any faith or hope of justice from the Western powers, but they believed that now the prestige is in their own hand. In fact, the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, one of the terms was the war indemnity clause. So 6,600 million pound was a disproportionately high amount. This was the amount, total amount which Germans had to pay to the Allied powers. And that is why one of the British, John Maynard Keynes, he in his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in December 1919, he said that this economic clause is going to perpetuate the economic crisis in Germany, and because of this economic crisis, the relation between Germany and the French will not improve, and it is going to result in another conflict. And he was absolutely right. So the Nazi party came, one of the basis of rise of Nazi party was that they offered employment. They offered employment to the German youth in the black shirts. And then they said that we will raise a large army, we will recapture the lost territories, we will avenge the humiliation of this. So Nazi propaganda was also based on countering and on defeating the terms of Treaty of Versailles. So we have to understand that political factors, the Europeans themselves were responsible for it. Another factor why also it appeared, because people had lost faith in democracy. There was completely failure of the democracy, And why? Because the governments were weak. Like in Italy, immediately after the end of World War, there was a political instability for say 3 years. 6 coalition governments fell within a matter of 3 years. In Germany, the proportional coalition government, that is Weimar Republic, that was formed, was a weak government. In fact, the Weimar Republic was also always seen by the Germans. So in Germany, the Weimar Republic, it was seen as a weak government. People did not have faith in this government. It was seen as a symbol of national disgrace. So in this background, we see that they needed masihas. They needed strong governments. They needed governments or state to revive the economy, to give employment to the youth, to salvage the pride. So all these aspects. So this is the political instability and also the failure of liberal democracy. After the Russian Revolution, A.G.P. Taylor writes, he writes that there is another dimension to the rise of fascism. A.G.P. Taylor, a prominent historian. He writes that one of the reasons why fascism emerged was because the capitalist class feared, especially after the Great Depression. The Great Depression meant that it was the failure of the market-led economy, and that presaged the way for the rise of second front, that is communism and socialism. So the fear of rising communists, the fear of Red Scare, the fear of communists take over. That is called as Red Scare. Gripped the minds and hearts of the middle class capitalists, especially in Germany, when in 1932, there was this great fire, Reichstag. The German parliament was burnt down and they believed that communist is responsible. So in this background, despite the fact that Hitler had lost the he had lost the presidential elections, a delegation went and met President Hindenburg and requested him to elect Hitler. So we find that there are multiple aspects. Another aspect, political, when we talk about, we can say, as Roger Griffin has written in his theory. Roger Griffin has given the idea of polygenetic nationalism. Polygenetic nationalism, so he says polygenetic nationalism, and also will come, means that nation is in crisis. National pride has been hurt. There is a need to salvage the national pride. So we need a strong leader. We need somebody who can do so. So all these people were also driven by this idea of aggressive nationalism. So nationalism was also one of the pretexts on which Nazism and fascism politics was actually being run. So because of all these aspects, you can write that political factors, economic factors, prolonged economic crisis. So we know that there was economic crisis in Germany immediately because of this war indemnity. And then in 1923, in Germany, there was hyperinflation. And then some rescue, which was the Dawes Plan, that also could not continue for long. 1924, when Great Depression happened. So you have to write that following the Great Depression, the German economy was in shambles. And Benito Mussolini also promised that I will help you. So it is the failure of the existing government to solve these economic crises, unemployment crisis, falling currency, that people took the recourse to rapid militarization, military and rapid industrialization based growth. So these are the factors. These are the factors we can say which was responsible for the rise of fascism. Moving ahead, the next question. The state was the most important factor in the industrialization of Russia. Now, the challenge in this question is that it is a 10-marker question. So, what is the role of state? And here when you talk about state, then the first thing that you have to mention is that why in Russia we see a state rail-led industrialization, unlike Western Europe where we have a market-led or capitalist-led or a more organic industrialization. So, one of the reasons why in Russia we have a state-led is because we have weak infrastructure. Infrastructure connectivity is very poor. Geographical condition is also very punishing. Underdeveloped capitalist class. Why we don't have a capitalist class? Because trade and commerce, Russia was not able to take benefit of it. It did not have access to all-weather seaports. Russia was literally cut off from the rest of Europe when Europe was seeing commercial revolution. In Russia, still there was agriculture-based economy. So we have agrarian economy. So in this background, we see the role of state. So there are a number of, I would say, countries where industrialization was state-led. Like you see in the case of Japan also. You see state has also played some role in the case of German industrialization also. So everywhere, we cannot say that it was a completely market-led or capitalist-led like we see in the case of Britain. In fact, in the case of France also, as far as industrialization is concerned, the initiative was taken by the state. France had a capitalist class, definitely, but they needed channels for investment. The state has played everywhere an important role in creation of infrastructure. So then we move ahead and we see what are the prominent initiatives. If we talk about the initiatives, which are the important initiatives, because it is a 10-marker question. So we have to quickly come to the initiatives. So we will start with that after the say defeat in the Crimean War. So when they were defeated in the Crimean War 1854-56, they understood that one of the primary reason is the poor industrial backwardness. So post Crimean War, we see development of military industrial complex. So they started on setting up military industries. They started focusing upon shipbuilding. They started focusing upon making arms industries, iron works. So we see that these military industrial works or complex, which are also called as Putilov works, shipbuilding, they were state controlled. So this is first thing. Second, one of the reasons why in Russia industrialization was not happening is because the significant proportion of working population were serfs. They were tied to the feudal lords. Feudalism existed in Russia a lot late when it was already a dead force in the rest of Europe. So Tsar Alexander II, his Emancipation Law 1861 was a game changer. What they did is that they abolished serfdom. They abolished serfdom, and not only they abolished serfdom, but they gave advance payments to buy lands. They can buy land. However, this payment was recovered in the form of annual payment, that is redemption payment. But at least what it did is that now there was a lot of workforce available, and some of this workforce would later be diverted towards the industries. So this is one very important thing. After this, we see that in Russia, they started focusing upon the export of grains. So they realized, where do we bring the money to fund the infrastructure projects? So they started exporting grains, export of grains. The life of a freed peasant was still not easy because the taxation was high. They used to collect a lot of taxes were also collected in kind, and they were exporting grains to Europe to fund infrastructure. So you have to write all this. In fact, the person who I can say who was the pioneer of modern industrialization in Russia was the Russian finance minister from 1892 to 1904, Sergey White. So somewhere you can write Sergey White. This person paid a lot of attention on infrastructure development. 1894 is also a very important year when the dual alliance between France and Russia was signed, and France started sharing technology and even gave cheap credit to Russians. So it is under his time, under his initiative, Sergey Witt, that we find they started laying the framework and they started building a very grand infrastructure project, that is the Trans-Siberian Railway. It is because of this and later the promotion and the inflow of foreign capital, mainly from France, that Russian industrialization started growing. And we see that in Russia, the industrial centers were limited to certain centers, certain towns emerged as industrial hub. They focused on metallurgical works. So this was the first phase. Then the second phase of industrialization was, I would say, after the Russian Revolution 1917. Mainly two initiatives of Lenin. You can write the new economic policy, where they mixed capitalism with communism. They earmarked that there are certain industries which will be under state control, the heavy industries, and there are other industries like the consumer goods which will be under the private control. We again see the next boom in industrialization in the time of Stalin, Stalin's 5-year plan, Stalin's collectivization of agriculture, Stalin's focus on heavy industries, the large industrial complexes. So it is under Stalin's leadership that Russia emerged as an industrial and a military power. But then in the conclusion, you can start by writing, you can write that there are limitations. There are limitations to this type of state-led industrialization. One aspect good is that they were able to channelize all the resources of the state, whether it is natural resources, whether it is demographic resources, whether it is financial resources, towards industrialization. But another historian, Moshe Levin, so if you have scope, this is where the challenge is. That after writing the initiatives, you can just briefly in the conclusion, you can say that there are certain limitations of state-driven industrialization. As the historian Moshe Levin has written, that state-led industrialization compromises efficiency. So it is not very efficient. There is a lot of corruption. There is corruption. There is there is no motivation for innovation. So innovation is something that is missing. You cannot find a lot of innovation. So you find that at times there is mislocation of resources also. There is sometimes selective focus on certain things. Like for example, in Russia, for a long time they did not focus much on consumer goods. So they were still dependent upon the Western Europe for the fulfilling the demand of consumer goods. So you can answer this question by writing all these aspects. The Second World War was a truly global conflict. Now I would say this question, because it is a 20-marker question. So if in this question you can draw a map, roughly a world map, where you can indicate which are the areas or prominent areas where the war happened. So when we say that it was a global conflict, I would appreciate, because it is a 20-marker, you can just show the various, I would say, arenas: Southeast Asia, Pacific, East Asia, China region, then Indo-China region, then Northern African region, Europe is there, right? So we find that if you can just highlight and who are the major players or which are the nations at war, then it would look like a very good answer. Now, why it is called as a truly global conflict? Then you can definitely start by writing that the First World War was largely a European warfare because most of the conflict and most of the stakeholders were European. In Second World War also, we find that mostly it is European powers, but other powers also have more actively participated. For example, if you see the contribution of US, if you see the involvement of China, if you see the involvement of India, then or if you see the involvement of Northern Africa, say Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, then it is much more in the Second World War, not only in terms of participation of people, but also the impact of it. So, First World War can be called as a European war with its splinters in, say, Southeast Asia and somewhere, I would say, Southeast Asia mostly. Indian subcontinent was not affected by it. So why do we call the Second World War as a global war if this comes? And I think it is a PYQ question. It is a PYQ question. It is a simple question. The only thing that you have to write in this question in a well-structured manner is that you have to make categorization so that you don't get lost. So in these type of questions which are very easy, are pretty straightforward, you have to create dimensions. Now what are the different dimensions that you will create in this answer? Let's understand. So first you will say that it was a war in which many nations across the world have participated. So there was global participation. So we have two sides, allied sides and Axis powers. Allied powers, you can write that we have Britain, France, US, Russia, China. So all these and then colonies were involved. And Axis powers, we know it is the Germans, the Italians and the Japanese. And then other powers were also there. Like Bulgaria is there, Romania is there, Hungary is there. So they are there. Second, you can say that the theater of the war was not limited to Europe, unlike the First World War. So we see multiple theaters of war or arenas of war, whatever you want to write. So Western Europe, Eastern Europe, when Hitler started expanding, moving eastwards after capturing Poland into deep Russian territory. So this time, even the deep Russian territories, as far as Stalingrad was affected by it. And then Pacific theater. So the conflict in the Pacific between the Japanese and the US, Pearl Harbor attack. Then in some way in Philippines, where even Australians, New Zealand, they were involved. Then we find Midway, multiple places are there. Then North Africa, you can say in Egypt, where the very famous battle like Alamein battle, in which the British were able to push back the expanding Nazis. Tunisia is there. So all these nations are there. Southeast Asia, Malaya Peninsula, Indochina. Even they had come strikingly close to India. In fact, they had reached till Imphal. So all these multiple theaters are there. It can be called as a global conflict, not only because of the course of the war, but also the impact of the war. So the impact of World War I was mainly European. Yes, we see that following the end of World War I, there was reorganization of the Arab states under Ottoman control, under the mandate system. But rest of the world was not affected as much by the war as it is in the case of Second World War. So Second World War was more devastating. Second World War was an eye-opener, especially the use of atom bomb revealed the world the threat of weapons of mass destruction. And therefore, we see a much more representative, a much more democratic global institution emerging, learning from the mistakes of League of Nations and the concert of Europe, that is the emergence of United Nations. So we find that the emergence of United Nations, the beginning of the era of decolonization. So we find that World War I had devastated the European economy. And for many of these colonial powers, now the colonies were more like a liability. So they wanted to get rid of it. And also there was a positive sentiment. Even amongst the allied powers, US was pushing because US wanted that the colonies should get free. So there was the beginning of the era of decolonization. So this is very, very important. And many soldiers who had fought, like Indian soldiers, the Nigerian soldiers, the Ghana soldiers, they had seen the quality of life in Europe, they were also inspired by these political ideas, political atmosphere. So we see a wave of nationalism. Immediately after World War I, we know that in India, there was INA trials, Royal Indian Navy mutiny, and the reason is that they are demanding the same treatment. So this is very important. And even during the war, if you see that even during the war, there was economic globalization of the conflict. So I want you to write certain very key words when you write answers, that during the war, there was economic globalization. Economic globalization of the conflict. It means that the Second World War, because it was so spread out, so there was a need to establish global chain networks of supply and demand. There was a need for that. Therefore, during this war, USA, under the Lend-Lease program, we find that US was supplying food, US was supplying fuel, US was supplying equipments, all this to many parts of the world, like to China, to Soviet Union, to Britain, so multiple places. But we also see that while there was economic globalization, means there was spread of the chain, but we also see there was disruptions. Global disruptions were also very common. Disruptions, especially when the German U-boats, they attacked and they destroyed a number of cargoes. The transatlantic trade was threatened and was adversely affected by it. When the Japanese captured Southeast Asia, they massacred so many people. The Southeast Asian trade, the Malacca trade, was very much affected by it. So we find that civilians were affected, people in various parts were affected, new types of, I would say, exploitation, especially the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust shook the world. There was genocide in Armenian region, so that was there. There was death due to famine in Bengal. The Bengal famine, 1943. Was very devastating, and parts of China also there was famine. So this war, we find that although efforts were being made to continue the supply and to maintain the supply of food, medicine and resources, still there was global disruptions also, sometimes because of war and sometimes because of misallocation of resources. So we know that in Bengal the famine was devastating, not only because of the crop failure, but because of the diversion of Burmese rice by Winston Churchill. And then the impact of the war was not only the emergence of international institutions like UN, then moving towards GATT, Bretton Woods, but also the emergence of Cold War. So it led to a new type of conflict. So friends during war did not remain friends after the war, or allies during the war did not become friends after the war. So all these aspects you can write in the answer. Moving to the next question. Discuss the different stages of European economic integration. So if we try to understand what are the different stages of European economic integration. So this is a question which has been asked in the past, but now this question you can expect more and more questions from this area because Europe is again in news. So when we talk about European economic integration, this is question 7b. Stages in European economic integration. In this question, you can definitely write about the various institutions, the various important treaties, treaties of Lomme, the Treaty of Rome, Lomme Convention, Maastricht Treaty, all this. But you also have to focus on the idea. You have to focus on the challenges. What is the idea? what are the ideas behind economic integration of Europe? And second, what are the challenges? So because it is a 20-marker question, you have to also briefly write the challenges and possibly how were these challenges overcome. What are the differences? And then at the end, when you conclude, then you can say that despite these integration, what are the present challenges? Or what are the present ruptures in European economy, in European diplomacy, so when we talk about Europe after Second World War, European countries were devastated, and there was a realization that individually we cannot recover fast. We need to come together. And the first person, I would say, if not the architect, but the person who conceived and was able to implement his idea of integration was Paul Henry Spaak. Paul Henry Spaak. 1944, when the custom union Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg was formed. This was also the time when Britain and France were negotiating, and they were in the final stages of concluding the Dunkirk Treaty. So many nations wanted integration. Germans were eager to integrate with Europe. France and Germans wanted to repair the relations and move together fast. So that is why we find that the two architects of European economic and political integration is not France and Britain. In fact, Britain is in a state of confusion. We'll see. It is France and Germany. France and Germany. And when I say Germany, I mean Western Germany. So when we talk about integration, then integration of Europe was in West. It happened in a more freer and a more democratic manner. And integration in the East was, I would say, in a more controlled manner, in a more, I would say, imposed manner. But this integration would not last. And then after the collapse and after the fall of the Soviet Union and the communist governments, the Eastern European countries would be invited and they would gradually start joining the European Union. But we'll focus on this part, that is during Cold War. So as I was saying that, there was this urge was there. In fact, 1943, Winston Churchill was the person who had also advocated the idea of a Council of Europe. So everybody realized that we have to move together. We cannot keep fighting with each other. We find that first time, if we understand that first time, Robert Schuman, he had also said something about it, that we have to, France and Germany must come together. Then we find that there were people like federalists. So as I say, that there were many people who wanted integration. So people like Henry Paul Spaak, there was Winston Churchill. 1943, when he spoke about Council of Europe, this was an idea. And then there was the French minister Robert Schuman. All these people, many people were there who spoke about some form of economic integration. And because of the Russian threat, we see the idea of collective defense crystallized in the form of NATO. However, there was some confusion that what degree and to what level of integration we must have. So while on one hand, there were federalists who wanted a very close integration. They wanted something like United States of Europe. British did not, or they were not okay with this idea of closer integration. They feared that too much of integration means the loss of sovereignty. And European powers were also scared that Britain will not come alone. Britain will come with the entire Commonwealth. So we'll say that this will create some friction between Britain and France. So then there were people who stood for close state cooperation. It should not be, a body should not be there, but there should be close state cooperation. So in this background, we see that in this background, the idea of economic integration was laid. And how did this happen? It started with a number of treaties. So I would not discuss at length. I will just give you an overview, and then you can check the PDF. In that PDF, I have in detail mentioned all the developments. So like the Treaty of Brussels 1948, when they said that we should come together militarily, politically and economically. And then in 1948, they formed the Organization of European Economic Cooperation. So they formed OEEC. And later in 1951, under the leadership of France and Western Germany, they formed European Coal and Steel Community. However, when all this was getting formed or was getting crystallized, Britain did not join because of its own reservation. It felt that it might compromise its sovereignty. And Britain was pretty confident that it can go alone well. Following the Treaty of Rome, 1957, they formed a custom union, European Economic Community. So custom union, I hope you understand, custom union where you have a very favorable trade relations with each other, where you lower the tariff between the trade between member states. So all these aspects were there. However, Britain proposed its own counter organization, EFTA, European Free Trade, but EFTA could not match the success of EEC. So we find that there was a conflict, or I would not say conflict, a competition was going on, EFTA versus EEC. This was France-led, this was Britain-led. Eventually, British realized that even without Britain, France is doing very well. And later in 1961, Britain will want to join it, but then France will resist. France believes that Britain will not only come alone, but Britain will bring the Commonwealth. They will also be benefited, and more than that, they will bring a transatlantic domination of US and Britain. They were scared of it. This was also the time when relations between France and US over the Polaris missile, and later we see 1966 France will withdraw, France will leave NATO. So we find that in the process of economic integration, politics will also influence. Definitely, we cannot separate politics and economy. So political ideas of leaders like Charles, so there was a French leader, Charles de Gaulle. He was against British joining EEC. So as long as this gentleman is in the scheme of things till 1959, Britain will not, till 1969, Britain will not be able to join. So that is one thing. Another very interesting aspect of their integration was agricultural integration. So in 1962, the members of EEC came together and they formulated the Common Agricultural Policy 1962. Common Agricultural Policy. So this was Common Agricultural Policy. The idea was to promote and support the farmers of the member states to prevent them from the competition of other players. And one of the reasons why France also did not want Britain to join is because France was aware of the fact that British agriculture is a highly efficient, more profitable, and British agricultural goods are much cheaper, so they will capture the market in these countries. So that because of this. However, the Common Agricultural Policy 1962, it contributed significantly to the growth of agriculture in all these member countries. However, after this stiff and this resistance, in 1973, finally, we find that the European Economic Community was expanded, including countries like Britain, Denmark, Ireland. So the EFTA countries were gradually allowed. While they were cooperating and developing very quickly on the trade front, the idea of a common currency or the idea of having some mechanism to tackle this fluctuation of currency was gaining currency. So they were moving. We'll see that later. What is the idea or how are they going to reach to this euro? So in 1979, they finalized the European monetary system. Very interesting. Closed monetary policy integration. So European monetary system. European monetary system. So this was to stabilize the European countries' currencies, to as far as shield them from the volatilities of fluctuation of currencies and to help them to peg against a common currency. So the idea was to stabilize. And then gradually in 1986, they created a single European market. So they are moving towards a free market mechanism to enable the free movement of goods, services and people. So they created a single European Act and they created a market in this. Finally, all these aspects at the end of Cold War enabled them to finalize and come up with a closer political, diplomatic and economic union, that is European Union 1993. So it is by the Treaty of Maastricht following this, the European Union was formed. And then they created the European and Monetary Union. So all these aspects you can keep writing. Then gradually after the Cold War came to an end, there was greater integration of European countries from the East. So after writing all these aspects, you can move ahead and write about the challenges. So what are the challenges it has faced? Challenges in the light of COVID, challenges in the light of Eurozone crisis 2011, challenges in the crisis in the wake of 2008 crisis. So they have also tried to cope up and tackle these crises in 2020 to 2012 in the wake of Eurozone crisis, when PIGS countries, Portugal, Ireland, Greece and Spain were affected more and they were demanding a bailout. They created a European stability mechanism so that they can provide some financial assistance. So these all aspects we can discuss. You can discuss all these aspects when you write your answer, that how the challenges were overcome and then what are the present day challenges. Next question is the nature of apartheid regime in South Africa. It has undermined its claim of being a democratic polity. So I remember that 2-3 years back they had asked a question that give an account of apartheid. And again they have asked this question, but this time they have asked a question by saying that if you try to analyze the nature of apartheid, which was a regime or an era of systematic, institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination of a significant proportion of Africans. So you have to understand that when you write about apartheid, then you have to introduce it. That what do you mean by apartheid? So in this question, they have said that how apartheid and the policies which is a part of apartheid has undermined the democratic credentials of South Africa. So how it has undermined the democratic credentials? So there are two ways of writing. You have to say that what are the facets of a democratic polity? Political freedom, economic democracy, spatial democracy. So what do you expect in a democracy? Protection of civil rights. People have freedom. Economic democracy means people have access to resources of economic development. They can develop economically and they can also contribute to the economic development. So you have to take these aspects of democracy and see to what extent and how these features of democracy was severely undermined in South Africa. So if we start with apartheid, then I would say that first start with the explanation on apartheid. So this is question 7C. Versus democracy. So try to introduce that the period 1948 to 1992 or 1994 when Nelson Mandela was elected, so you can write 92 or 94. So this was a period of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination. Racial segregation and discrimination of the majority of South Africans. So who are these people? Indigenous blacks, Zulus, Indians, and colored race, mixed people. This was the period when we talk about democracy. So what do you mean by democracy? Democracy means the rule of the people. Democracy means a political democracy. So we'll start understanding that which aspects of democracy were compromised. First is political democracy. So what do we understand by political democracy? Political democracy means the participation of people in political decision making. Political democracy means people have political rights. They have right to vote. They have right to contest elections. They are treated as equal citizens. Whereas in the case of apartheid, these people, the majority people, were dominated. So we see that under apartheid, there was no political democracy. In fact, political power was concentrated with 15% of the whites. They had this power. And not only they had this power, this section was completely denied right to vote, but a number of laws were passed which were extremely discriminatory in nature, like Population Registration Act. So you can say Population Registration Act 1950 required the registration of all population and their segregation based on races. White, black, Indian, colored. And then the indigenous peoples. So we find that these indigenous peoples, Bantus, they were also restricted to live in certain lands or known as Bantustan. So there was another law, Bantus self-government law, 1951. So these indigenous people, they were denied freedom of movement. They were made to stay in certain areas, homeland. So we see spatial segregation was there. So this is one aspect. Then we see another aspect of political democracy is that in a political democracy, the government is committed. So we had seen or we had discussed that in social contract, the government is accountable to the people. The government has to protect the rights of the people. The government is for the people. So one of the aspects of political democracy is protection of civil rights. Did they protect the civil rights of all the people? No. In fact, they suppressed the basic rights of the people, and many of the anti-apartheid activists, they were branded as communists and they were put in jail. Some of them were killed, executed. So in fact, a law was passed, Suppression of Communism Act. By the Suppression of Communism Act, (1950), many of these anti-apartheid activists, even Nelson Mandela, they were put behind bars, being branded as communist sympathizers. We know the very famous Rivonia trials. So under the Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela was sentenced to 27 years of imprisonment, 1963-64. And not only it was about suppression of the people, in fact, there was use of violence also, like the Sarpeville massacre. (1960), in which the people opened fire upon unarmed protesters. So we find that there was no political democracy. Then when we move ahead, we'll talk about economic democracy. In a simple manner, what do you mean by economic democracy? Economic democracy means everybody has equal economic opportunities, equal economic liberties. They are allowed to they are given access to government offices based on merit. So while this did not happen, this was not something that happened. In fact, on the other hand, the whites were given access. They had more privileges to better housing, better jobs, healthcare facility. So we find that economic democracy was also denied. We find that another aspect of democracy is what we can say spatial democracy. Freedom to move, settle in any part of the country. In India also, this is largely provided except some of the scheduled areas where you cannot buy land. So by the Group Areas Act, this was also denied. By the Group Areas Act, there was racial segregation of residential areas. So again, ghettoization of the blacks happened. Ghettoization of the blacks. So there was a lot of anger, international opposition to apartheid. The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan had given a very famous speech, Winds of Change. NAM, United Nations, everybody has criticized. Everybody has criticized. And finally, by 1989, we see that apartheid was withdrawn. With the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, it was the success. And then the way in which he integrated different sections of the population, that is also a game changer. So we try to write this question in terms of what do we understand by democracy and its ideals. You don't have to just write about what happened there. Question number 8A, the emergence of two power blocks not only symbolized two competing ideologies, but two alternative models of economic growth. So basically it refers to the economic dimensions of the Cold War. So we know that Cold War, a term which was coined by Walter Lippmann, refers to a complex war where the two sides, US and Soviet Russia, never engaged in a direct confrontation, or there was never an open battle between them, although they participated into a number of regional conflicts taking sides, like the Korean War, the Vietnam War. But the Cold War is a proxy war. The Cold War is a war of ideologies. The Cold War is a war of alliance. The Cold War is a war of technological prowess. And the Cold War is also a war of two competing economic models. And we know that the economic model which prevailed in the end was the capitalist model of the US bloc. The capitalists were able to prevail. And one of the questions which was asked in this paper, that was the fall of governments in the autumn of 1989. So how do we write this? What should be the structure of it? So for question number 8A, first of all, try to briefly define what is Cold War. You can start by referring to Walter Lippmann. And then you can talk about that Cold War is a period of complex warfare and tension, a state of constant military preparedness, and a war which was seen in multiple ways. So there are multiple dimensions of the Cold War. We see there is, of course, the ideological dimension. It was out of ideological tensions after the Russian Revolution that we see a rift emerging between the first front and the second front. Then obviously the question which was asked was economic. Then we see there is also technological. Now technological is both space and military. So weapons of mass destructions were made based on the doctrine of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So briefly try to mention all this. Then we also see that there were strategic alliances that were formed on both the sides. We also see that they were engaged in a number of regional wars. And more than that, the Cold War also saw a conflict of doctrines. So we see doctrinal warfare. So there were a number of doctrines being formulated from both sides, such as Truman's doctrine, Eisenhower doctrine, Brezhnev doctrine, Reagan doctrine, Carter doctrine. So all these are there. Now, then we move to that although it was based on ideological grounds, but it was also about the competition between two sides who are trying to also capture the markets of the world. They're trying to mobilize more resources, because mobilizing more resources would also enable them to prepare for possibly an eventual war, at least to create a stronger deterrence against the opposition. So after writing this, then we talk about that, okay, what is the model when we say you can either write a, say, tabular form, because it is a comparison, or you can write point by point. So when we say the capitalist bloc, and then we say the socialist bloc, this was based on the idea of free market economy. This was based on the idea of command economy, where we see the state will retain its control over not only the means of production, but most of the economic resources and economic decision making. We see that here there was also a system of promotion of free trade, regional groupings or regional economic groupings. Example, you can write European Economic Committee. You can write about all this. Then you can also say that the European Recovery Plan, ERP, under the Marshall Plan, also enabled the joint growth of each other. This side, we find that they had their own set of regional grouping, because as Winston Churchill had famously said in his speech in May 1946, that an iron curtain has descended in Europe from the Baltic to the Adriatic Sea. So you can say that this iron curtain was not only the ideological divide, but it was also the economic divide. One very disturbing feature of the Cold War was that there was no trade relation. There was no trade relation except during 1970s due to the oil shock between this group and this group. So this group also had its own internal grouping. This group also came up with plans and packages like Molotov Plan, a package, economic package by the socialist Russia to enable the growth of Eastern European countries torn by the war. And then to mobilize the Molotov package, they had established the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, that is COMECON. We find that this side believed in the idea of liberal democracy. There was liberal democracy. Whereas this side, so even the capitalist class many times had representation, or they had lobbying power within the government. So here we find that capitalist had a fair ground. This side we see a unique culture of oligarchy. Oligarchy had emerged. Even today in Russia you see oligarchy is there. There is a very famous book by James Robinson. And this book, James Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail, has elaborated on possibly one of the main reasons why this side won and this side lost. They say that one of the remarkable aspects of the capitalist bloc or the capitalist nations, why they succeed, is because they have an inclusive economy. Inclusive economy is a more fair economy where there is more incentive for innovation, where there is more participative and open decision making. Whereas this side, the other side, the Soviet side, and in fact we find even in the case of China, North Korea, or many of the Arab states, we have what we call as extractive economy, where decision making is more centralized. The state is more obsessed or is more concentrated on extracting resources, concentration of power, concentration of financial resources, financial centralization, and then maybe they will do it. So here we find that it was organic growth. Here we find that there was also system of subsidies that had become very much popular. So the Eastern European countries were poorer compared to Western European countries. Therefore, they were dependent upon a number of subsidies. We find that the Soviet side was also a oil and gas and to some extent agriculture driven economy. Whereas in the case of this, it was a more balanced economy. We see that there was more balanced. They relied on trade and commerce. There was industrialization. Industries were on this side also. But the industries were not very much concentrated in one area. For example, in this side, when we talk about industrialization, they paid more attention on heavy industries and they neglected the consumer goods. Possibly they thought that heavy infrastructure, heavy goods industries, capital goods industries, military industries, they are the backbone and they are most important for a nation's well-being and nation's strength. They were right. But they did not understand that masses also need food. Masses needs item of daily use. So this is something that this side we have a balanced economic, balanced and all around economic growth and plus industrialization. Diversified industrialization. This side we see that there was heavy industries. Collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industries and the model of 5-year plan are the 3 pillars of command economy. So you have to understand that we have to write these keywords also. That we find that yes, they paid attention on heavy industries. They talk about collectivization. And collectivization was forced collectivization. Collectivization of agriculture, nationalization of industries and planned economic growth. So these are the 3 main pillars, the roots of which can be found in the Russian economic model after the 1917 revolution. And most of these ideas actually were successful and were introduced by Joseph Stalin. So Stalin is most of the economic ideas or the economic practices were the brainchild of Stalin. Although we find that in the time of Nikita Khrushchev, there was an attempt to detach from Stalin's model. There was an attempt to, I would say, to diversify the economic base. But still, Nikita Khrushchev was also not to an extent successful to completely bring the overall. That is why we read that by 1985, Gorbachev in the famous Leningrad address had acknowledged the disparity in the quality of life, the disparity in the per capita income between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So this side we don't find all this. This side we find that there was minimum interference of the state. So you can write all these aspects. You can say that on this side we see that along with the states there were economic institutions like IMF, World Bank. They also played an important role. Whereas this side we find that most of the economic decisions were taken by Russia. So as long as Russia was doing well, as long as Russia had necessary resources, this side, which was also called as the prison of nation, the prison of nations would remain intact. The moment Russia will fall, this economy will fail. And that is why by the time Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika. So the idea of glasnost and perestroika was to make the Soviet economy more efficient. The idea was not to completely change the command economy, but the idea was to incorporate the positive and the efficient manner, the features of the Western model and make the Soviet economy. So the idea of glasnost and perestroika was to bring rapid acceleration in the Soviet economy, that is uso-kerene. But did it succeed? No. In our test series, we had asked a very good question, and I want you to ponder over it. That why the command economy in Soviet Russia failed, whereas the command economy or the socialist economy in China led to the rise of China as an economic superpower by 2010. So that is a very good question. Try to ponder over it, and sometimes we can discuss this question. So you can write all these aspects, but you can say that Cold War was also about, in the conclusion, you can say that in the Leningrad conference, 1985, in the Leningrad speech, Gorbachev had acknowledged, and we know which side had won. So it is because of this economic failure that Soviet Russia, USSR had collapsed by 1991. Next question, if we see, to what extent the poor situation in Latin America, the underdevelopment in Latin America is due to neo-imperialism. So they have asked this question that what do you think that even after the Latin American countries gained independence, what holds them back? So I remember that few years back, a very similar question was asked with respect to Africa. What holds Africa back? And why do we see this culture of civil wars, military coup, so much of genocide in Africa today? What is the main factor? Is it the geographical factors? Is it historical factors? Because we know that the cradle of civilization in Africa, but we will focus in this question on Latin America. So in this question on Latin America, we will first try to understand what is neo-imperialism. So in this question, you can introduce neo-imperialism briefly. Neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism refers to the various mechanisms or the ways by which former colonial powers and the economically powerful states have maintained control and influence over the independent states even in the present times. So that is, it can be political influence, it can be economic influence, or it can be a combination of all this. Sometimes it is also in the garb of culture that they are actually furthering their economic ideas. So then you have to understand that even the fact that Latin American colonies, most of the colonies except Cuba and Puerto Rico had become independent by 1820s. So they had become independent, yet we find that they are lagging. So we have certain offshoots. We see that there have been phases of good growth in case of Brazil, in case of Chile, in case of Argentina, but that has also not been a sustainable growth. So when we talk about that, analyzing the underdevelopment, So then when we talk about the underdevelopment of Latin America or Latin American states, let's write, then what could be the factors? You can say historical factors. So you can start with historical factors. So we can say that Latin American colonies are example of extractive commercial colonies, where Portuguese and the Spanish were the more dominant. So Portuguese and Spanish extracted raw materials such as sugar, such as tobacco, rubber, and then also there was extensive mining. So the idea was to extract more resources, and not only this, so they used to extract more and more. It was more like an agricultural farm, it was more like a mining farm. And even the silver, which was mined in huge quantity, it is said that after the discovery of silver mines, there was price revolution. So there was the liquidity crisis that was seen in Europe in 14th century was not only addressed, but the European market was overwhelmed with a lot of silver in 16th century. So on one hand, they created this extraction, one-way extractive model. There was drain of wealth. On the other hand, in these Latin American colonies, we find that the property, the land holding, was concentrated in the hands of Creole elites. So whatever wealth was generated, whatever resources were there, that was also concentrated in the hands of few. And these people, the Creoles who fought, the Creoles are basically the Spanish and the Portuguese settlers, mainly the Spanish settlers. So these who fought against the crown, they maintained their political hegemony and economic influence even after independence. So we find that in Latin America, the Spanish promoted the rise of an elite section. So I always say this in class, that one of the reasons why in India we see there is so much of growth and prosperity, because in India we have a democratic polity and democratic economy. Whereas contrasting in Pakistan, you see that in Pakistan wealth is there, but wealth, power, influence, fame, everything is concentrated by certain regions and certain cities. So if you connect Lahore, Rawalpindi and Islamabad, then all the cricketers, film stars you will find from that region. So similarly here also, in Latin America, the Spanish had introduced the encomienda system, by which they rewarded these Creoles for their service to the crown, for enslaving the people and for extracting resources. And this system continued. Even after independence, even when they became independence, we see that there was USA's influence. USA maintained its influence, and because they did not have resources, so US capitalists started investing. And in 1823, US, by the Monroe Doctrine, declared that South America is my satellite zone. So they said that Europeans have no authority to interfere or to have independent economic relations. So US restricted the options of the South American colonies to diversify and have trade relations. That was the time when we see that Britain also supported US. Britain also did not want countries like France, countries like Spain to have very good relations with it. So we find that from that time there is too much of dependency on US. And later we'll see that when governments emerged who resisted the US policies, US did not hesitate to even start or to even initiate political military coup. They had even tried to assassinate Fidel Castro also. So we see that even after independence, a type of, we can say, a type of neo-imperialism, something of US was there. Most of the prominent industries, whether it is the sugar industries, whether it is the tobacco industries, were owned by US capitalists. So the benefit was largely extracted by the capitalists, by the MNCs of US, and some of the benefits was shared with the local elites. Then we find that Gradually, other multinational companies also started coming up. And then there was what we see, crony capitalism. So this is what we see in the case of extractive economies. Crony capitalism became very famous, where the government started giving land at throwaway prices. For example, one of the companies that comes to our mind is United Fruits Company. The United Fruits Company acquired acres of land in Central America for growing banana and for processing different types of fruit. So because of this, we find that the local people were not able to grow these crops, fruits, and sell them in the market and benefit. And most of these profits which was generated by the horticulture farms was repatriated. So all this was remitted outside. So because of all these factors, we find that historical factors we can see. And then even if there was trade, the system of trade was not fair trade. So we find that there was trade imbalance. The system of trade was not a fair trade. We find that from Latin America, raw materials, sometimes cheap labor were sent to USA, to Europe, and from there finished goods would be imported. So whatever money they made by exporting, most of that money was spent on these imports. So this created a dependency theory and the neo-mercantilistic policies of US. So US also practiced in many ways neo-mercantilistic policies by which they pressurized the governments to pass favorable trade policies. So that is why many theorists, I remember the name of Raoul Prebisch. So he says, he has written about this dependency theory. So they were very much dependent on their daily consumption on countries, industrialized nations of US and Europe. And the other problem with some of the economies which were doing well was they were too much dependent upon the trade in one good. For example, for Brazil, it was coffee. For Venezuela, it was oil. So we find that another factor which led to the decline of their economy, or there was no all-round growth, was a very interesting phenomena, that is Dutch disease syndrome. So Dutch disease syndrome basically refers to the economic imbalance that is created in many countries when it is too much reliant on one good or one commodity. But then what happens that on one hand you neglect other areas. On the other hand, you are too much dependent upon the well-being or too much dependent upon the profitability of a commodity. And because of the volatility in the world market, when the prices crash, your economy will also be affected. So this is something which is a problem for Latin American countries also. For example, we see in the case of Brazil, coffee. We see in the case of Venezuela, oil. We see in the case of Argentina, in case of wheat. So they were susceptible to the volatility of the world market. And in this scenario, what can prevent the farmers from the volatility is the economic potential or the shock absorbing ability of the state government. But the governments themselves are corrupt. And then we find the debt theory. So these countries used to take a lot of loan. Debt. That has been a persistent problem of many of the countries. The IMF and World Bank, they would give loans, but the loans will come up with structural adjustment criteria, something we have seen in the case of India also. Structural adjustment criteria. So they were asked to formulate policies such as austerity measures. They were forced to open up their markets. They were forced to give favorable trade positions to many of the MNCs. And this did not go well with the local economy. So due to so much of dependency on this foreign debt, Latin America in 1980s, we see debt crisis was there. So it was through IMF and World Bank also that US was controlling many of these economies. So you can see that these are the factors, and then definitely there is political imperialism. So if you see economic, then there is political imperialism. Means the dissident states or the recalcitrant leaders were eliminated. So those who stood against, जिसने भी खिलाफी की, they were removed, or they were attempt to remove them. You have so many examples. For example, 1954 in the case of Guatemala, when their democratic elected government of Jacob Alvarez, that person was removed. So you see so many examples. (1954). 1959, Bay of Pigs. In the case of Cuba, Fidel Castro, everybody knows about it. 1973, Chile, so many examples. So they did not shy away from interfering and from instating puppet governments also. So this is also one of the means. But then you will change the discourse. In the answer, you will say that beside these external factors, besides the historical factors, there are certain internal factors also which is responsible for the poor state of Latin American colonies. What are these factors? You can say political corruption. You can write political corruption, red tapeism. They do not have a historical understanding and maturity for democracy. So they have always seen strong governments, military governments. So this democratic culture is not ingrained. And today what we see, today still a mercantilistic warfare is going on. Today also we see a neo-mercantilistic war is going on, or competition is going on. On one hand we have China. आज ये मसला है. And on the other hand you have US and you have European states. Yes, some of the countries have emerged powerful and some of them have become vocal, like Brazil. Brazil is the flag bearer of the sovereignty of these states. We have seen there has been reaction against neo-imperialism. For example, Pink Tide. So what have been the various reactions? Pink Tide was a set of revolutions which occurred in a number of South American states where we see the rise of socialist regimes. The socialist regimes in Chile. You have leaders like Hugo Chavez who have stood against the interference of countries like US. And this has also complicated relations. US has also blamed these South American countries for promoting immigration, drug trafficking, all these drug mafia. They say that most of the criminals, they cross over illegally from the south and they are the nuisance creators. So all these aspects you can write. You can end this answer by referring to what have been the reactions against the neo-imperialism, or you can also refer to the neo-mercantilistic war. The next question is on Ho Chi Minh. Now when we talk about Ho Chi Minh, then I remember reading a book of Ramchandra Guha, the prominent leaders of South Asia, Lee Kuan Yew, Nehru, Sukarno. Ho Chi Minh also finds mention in that book. So there have been in the history of many colonial states a number of leaders who have not only played a very important role in their independence, but to a large extent they were also responsible for the formation of the nation, for creating or for giving an ideology or a philosophy and an outlook and vision to the nations. So which are these leaders? One of the leaders is Ho Chi Minh. Born in a very poor family in 1890, he from his childhood was exposed and was aware of the exploitations of the French. So he had seen how the French had been exploiting the Vietnamese. His father was a nationalist, so the ideas of nationalism was ingrained in his genes, or I can say that it was a part of his upbringing. So because this question, if you see the question is not only about his contribution in the Vietnamese war in the independence of Vietnam, but the question is how did he emerge? So when the question is how did he emerge, then you have to say what are the various contributions of him. So that is why I'm giving you some background. You don't have to write about his family, but you can definitely say that he was a nationalist due to his upbringing. In 1911, he went to study abroad, means he went to Paris. From there, he went to America. And during his stay in America and European countries, he was exposed to the progressive political ideas of these thinkers. And he was very much influenced and inspired by Marxism-Leninism. When the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated, then he had even submitted a petition for Vietnamese independence. But that petition was obviously ignored at the Paris Peace Conference because the French were one of the important stakeholders. They were the important power brokers. So that initial setback only strengthened his resolve. He wanted to do more further. In 1930, so from here you have to start writing. 1919, he submitted a petition in the Paris Peace Conference, in the Versailles Paris Conference, where he has written about Vietnamese independence. Then in 1930, he founded the Vietnamese Communist Party. So a party to promote the idea of nationalism and also to mobilize masses based on the idea of communism and socialism. Then he returned to Vietnam, and in 1930s he started mobilizing masses and he started organizing revolts against the French presence. But in 1941 was the year when he formed his most important revolutionary group or the political party, that was Viet Minh. So 1919, 1930, then what he did in 1930s, and then 1941, the Viet Minh. Viet Minh, or the Vietnam Communist Party, which was a coalition of nationalists and communists. So he combined the idea of nationalism. He used to say that I am a nationalist first and then a communist later. The idea was to fight for independence. World War II came as a blessing when the Japanese were able to overthrow and force the French to evacuate. So during the war, he mobilized more support and he expanded the network of Viet Minh throughout Vietnam. After World War I, he had declared Vietnam as an independent country, thinking that the French have gone, the Japanese have surrendered. But his euphoria or his enthusiasm was short-lived when the French returned and they did not want to give away their control. So that is when he and his Viet Minh party started the Vietnam War of Independence. So he trained his revolutionaries in guerrilla warfare. He was not prepared for an open pitched battle. So he started guerrilla warfare. And then finally in 1954, when the French were defeated in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So when they were defeated in this battle, they surrendered, and following the 1954 Geneva Accords, independence was granted. But then independence came at a huge cost, because at that time we see that Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel into two groups, two parts, South Vietnam and North Vietnam. North Vietnam came under the influence of Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh party, and that time Vietnam War started 1954. And in this war was also a war of a Cold War in which China, Russia was on this side, and we find South Korea and US was fighting on this side. This war continued. Unfortunately, he could not live long and he died. So he died in 1969. And by the time he died in 1969, he had left a lasting legacy. The Vietnam War came to an end in 1975 and it was united. North and South Vietnam was united. And this person is remembered as a central figure. So because it is a 10-marker question, so you can write all these important milestones. And then by 1969, when he had died, he was an important nationalist. And Vietnam, the independent Vietnam, was under the control of communists from the north because the Viet Minh party was more popular. The South Vietnam leader, Ngo, was not as popular despite the support which was given by US. So I think I have discussed these all questions are